The lawyer's letter came by certified mail on a Tuesday, and I signed for it myself at the door, in my socks, at 8 in the morning, because the mail carrier waited while I found a pen. Notice of Family Asset Distribution Meeting. That was the heading, typed in a law office 2 towns over, on letterhead I did not recognize. Addressed to me, Warren Alcott, sole owner of Alcott Precision Tool, at my own kitchen table. My 3 children had hired an attorney to schedule a meeting about dividing my company. While I was alive. While I was, as far as I knew that morning, in perfectly good health, drinking my coffee, reading a letter that treated me like a line item in an estate that hadn't opened yet. I want to tell you the sentence that stopped my hand halfway to the coffee pot, because it's the exact sentence that explains everything that came after that Tuesday. Near the bottom, under a paragraph about equitable division of Warren Alcott's holdings, there was a line that read, "Per prior family understanding, real property and equipment at the Route 9 facility to be allocated as follows." Prior family understanding. I have run Alcott Precision Tool for 38 years. I built it from a single Bridgeport mill in a rented bay to a shop with 22 employees and a building I own outright on Route 9. I have 3 children. Douglas, 41, Renee, 38, and Trevor, 34. And not one of them had ever, in any conversation I could remember, sat down with me and reached a prior family understanding about how my company would be divided, which meant one of 2 things. Either somebody had invented an understanding that never happened, or somebody had reached an understanding with someone else about my property without me in the room. I called the number on the letterhead. A paralegal answered, polite, careful, and told me she couldn't discuss the matter with me directly since I wasn't the retaining client, but that the meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at Douglas's house, and that all 3 of my children, plus their spouses, were expected to attend. All 3 of my children were expected to attend a meeting about my company. I was not on the list of expected attendees. I was the subject of the meeting. I sat at that table for a long time after I hung up. My wife Diane died 6 years ago, and there's a particular kind of quiet a house gets when something like that letter lands, and there's nobody across the table to say, out loud, what you're both thinking. I said it to the empty chair instead, the way I do more often than I'd admit. They've already decided I'm gone. Now, before you decide this is a story about ungrateful children, I want to slow down, because I've turned this over for months, and it isn't that simple. And if I tell it too simply, I'll be lying to you the same way somebody was lying to my kids. Because here's what I knew by Thursday. After 2 phone calls and 1 visit to my own attorney, a woman named Priya Anand, who has kept my company's paperwork honest for 11 years. Nobody had told my children the truth about how Alcott Precision Tool is actually structured. Not Douglas, who runs day-to-day operations and thinks of the shop as half his already. Not Renee, who married a man who does estate planning for a living and apparently started planning my estate before I asked him to. Not Trevor, the youngest, who mostly just wanted everyone to stop fighting and would sign whatever kept the peace. Somebody had given all 3 of them a version of my company that doesn't exist. A version where the building, the equipment, and the accounts were already, in some informal sense, divided 3 ways, waiting only for the paperwork to catch up to what everyone apparently already believed. I hadn't given them that version, which meant somebody else had. And I had 4 days to find out who, before I sat down at my own son's dining table on a Saturday, to hear my children discuss dividing a company I hadn't offered to divide, based on an understanding I had never reached, using numbers nobody had ever asked me to confirm. I'm 66 years old. I've spent 38 years reading blueprints, tolerances, and purchase orders. And if there's one thing that trade teaches you, it's this. When a number shows up on paper that you didn't put there, you don't argue with the number. You trace it back to the drawing it came from. I spent 4 days tracing a drawing, And what I found at the end of it wasn't a villain exactly. It was a son-in-law with a spreadsheet, a daughter who wanted to believe him, and 11 years of documents in my own filing cabinet that were about to matter more than anything anyone said at that table. My name is Warren Alcott. I grew up the son of a machinist in a town where the mill was the only real employer, and I learned tool and die work the way my father learned it, standing next to a man twice my age who didn't explain much and expected you to watch. I started Alcott Precision Tool in a rented bay behind a muffler shop 38 years ago, with a single Bridgeport mill I'd bought used and a hand-lettered sign. Diane did the books at our kitchen table for the first 9 years, and I did everything else. And between the two of us, we built a shop that makes precision components for aerospace and medical device manufacturers. Work with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Work where a mistake doesn't get fixed with an apology. Diane died 6 years ago, ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. And I'm not going to spend long on it, except to say that when she went, I did what men of my generation do badly. I went back to work 3 days after the funeral and let the shop be the thing I didn't have to feel anything about. I want to give you one image from those 18 months because it explains more about the 4 years that followed than any amount of explaining I could do directly. About 6 weeks before Diane died, when she was still lucid most days, she asked me to bring her the folder with the trust documents, the ones Priya had drawn up years earlier, and she went through them herself, in bed, with reading glasses and a yellow highlighter, checking every number against what she remembered from our own kitchen table bookkeeping decades before. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Warren, promise me you won't let this turn into a mystery after I'm gone. Kids fill in mysteries with whatever scares them most," I promised her. And then I spent 6 years doing exactly the thing she'd warned me against, not because I forgot the promise, but because keeping it meant sitting my children down with paperwork instead of feelings. And for a long time after she died, paperwork felt like the one language I couldn't stand to use with people I loved. I'd used it all day, every day, at the shop. I wanted my family to be the place where I didn't have to. That instinct, understandable as it was, is the reason a lawyer's letter showed up at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, 11 years after Diane first read that trust with a yellow highlighter in a hospital bed. My children handled her death 3 different ways, and understanding those 3 ways is the whole key to what happened 4 years later. Douglas, my oldest, threw himself into the business. He'd already been working the floor for a decade by then, learning the machines, and after Diane died, he started coming in earlier, staying later, taking on more of the operational load without being asked. I was grateful for it. I want that on the record before anything else, because Douglas is central to what went wrong, and I don't want anyone thinking I believe he set out to hurt me. Renee went the other direction. She'd left home at 19, gone into finance, married a man named Craig Bellamy, who does estate and trust planning for a wealth management firm in the city, 90 minutes from here. After her mother died, Renee started calling every Sunday, without fail, 6 years running. I looked forward to those calls. I still do. And I'll tell you now, because it matters later, that Craig started joining those calls about 2 years in. First just saying hello, then asking how the shop was doing, then asking increasingly specific questions I mistook, for a long time, for a son-in-law's polite interest. Trevor, my youngest, mostly disappeared into his own life. Not from cruelty. Trevor's never been cruel a day in his life, but from a kind of quiet avoidance that I recognize because I do it too. He calls on birthdays. He came for Christmas. He works in software 3 states away, and the shop has never interested him, and I never pushed it on him. And I think, looking back, that made him easy for other people to speak for. Here is the arrangement I actually built, and I want to lay it out plainly, because almost none of what follows makes sense if you don't understand the real structure, as opposed to the one my children were operating from. Alcott Precision Tool is a single-member LLC. I am the sole owner. There is no partnership agreement, no shareholder structure, no board. The building on Route 9, 41,000 square feet, purchased outright in 2009, no mortgage, is owned by a separate holding entity, Alcott Route 9 LLC, which I also own entirely, and which leases the building to the operating company at a below-market rate I set myself, because I wanted the operating business protected if anything ever went wrong on the equipment side. 11 years ago, on Priya Anand's advice, I set up a revocable trust, the Warren J. Alcott Living Trust. Both LLCs are held inside that trust. The trust names me as trustee during my lifetime, with full control, and it names a successor trustee, and it lays out, in language Priya wrote herself, and I read line by line before I signed it, exactly how the business and the building would transfer on my death or incapacity. I have updated that trust twice in 11 years, once after Diane died, to remove her as co-trustee, and once 4 years ago after Douglas asked me directly at this kitchen table what would happen to the shop when I was gone. I told him. I told all three of them, actually, at a dinner I called specifically for this purpose 4 years ago, the only family meeting about succession that I ever called myself. Here's what I told them that night, and I want it word for word, because it's the prior family understanding that actually exists, as opposed to the one somebody invented. Douglas would become majority owner and operator of the operating company, because he was the one doing the work and the one with the skill to run it. Renee and Trevor would each receive a fixed cash distribution from my personal accounts, funded by a life insurance policy I'd carried for exactly this purpose, so that Douglas wouldn't have to buy out his siblings from a company that couldn't afford it. The Route 9 building would stay in the trust and pass to all three equally, as a rental asset generating income for anyone who didn't want to be involved in the shop day to day. I said all of this out loud. I said it once, 4 years ago, at this table, over a pot roast Renee brought because she still thinks I can't cook, which, fair enough. And then I did what I have regretted every day since discovering what came next. I never wrote it down for them. I had it written down, precisely, in the trust documents in Priya's office, and in my own fireproof filing cabinet. But I never gave my children copies. I never walked them through the actual paperwork. I told myself, at 62 years old, that a verbal understanding among family was enough, that putting it all in writing and handing out copies felt like preparing for a fight nobody was having. 4 years of silence on the actual documents, 4 years for someone else to fill in the details. And the someone else, I learned that Thursday, sitting in Priya's office with 11 years of paperwork spread across her conference table, was my son-in-law, working from nothing but guesses, a general understanding of what self-made shop owner with 3 kids families usually do, and a genuine, if catastrophic, overconfidence in his own profession. Priya Anand has been my attorney for 11 years, ever since a supplier dispute that could have sunk the shop if I'd handled it as badly as I wanted to at the time. She's the kind of lawyer who reads a document twice before she tells you what it says, and Thursday afternoon, in her office, she read the certified letter twice, then set it down and asked me the question that started the actual investigation. Warren, does the phrase prior family understanding appear anywhere in your trust documents? It did not. I knew that before she confirmed it. My trust says what I told you. Majority operating interest to Douglas, fixed cash distributions to Renee and Trevor, the building held in trust for all three. Nowhere does it say anything about an understanding reached outside the document itself. So Priya asked the next question, the one that mattered. Then where did this letter's law firm get the language they used? Before that call, though, Priya made me do something I resisted at the time, and I'm grateful for now. She had me go back through my own phone, 6 months of it, and find every text message and voicemail related to the shop, the equipment, or the family's finances, and print them, dated in order. It took me most of Wednesday night, and reading my own messages back in sequence, stripped of the tone I'd meant them in, I understood for the first time how a careful, ambitious son-in-law might have built an entire structure out of my own casual words. There was a text to Douglas from 4 months ago. Might be time to think about bringing the kids in more, especially with the new equipment coming. I meant it exactly the way it sounds. A vague, fatherly, someday thought. The kind of thing a man says while he's actually thinking about something else entirely. In my case, a bid deadline. Read cold, out of context, forwarded from Douglas to Renee, and then summarized by Renee to Craig, it could easily become, Dad wants to bring the kids in as owners. There was another one, a voicemail to Renee from 5 months back, wishing her happy birthday, that ended with me saying offhand, "You know, your mother and I always wanted you three to have a stake in something real someday." I meant the sentiment the way any father means it at the end of a birthday call. General, warm, unplanned. Craig, building a file, would have heard a stake and written down equity. I want to be fair to myself here too, not just to my children. None of those messages were lies, and none of them were promises, but strung together by someone determined to find a plan in them. They were raw material enough to build one. Priya's point, when I showed her the printed pages Thursday morning, was simple. Warren, you didn't cause this by being dishonest. You caused part of it by being imprecise for years, in exactly the kind of casual language families use with each other, and lawyers are trained to formalize. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else she's ever told me. Precision and honesty aren't the same skill, and I'd spent 38 years mastering one of them on the shop floor, while letting the other one go soft at my own kitchen table. We called Craig's firm. Priya, not me. She's better at getting information out of another attorney's paralegal than I ever will be. And within 20 minutes, she had confirmed that the meeting had been requested, and the letter drafted at the instruction of Craig Bellamy on behalf of his wife Renee, and that the firm had been given, by Craig, a written summary of what he described as the family's existing understanding of the estate structure. A written summary, written by my son-in-law, about my estate, that he had never asked me a single question to verify. I want to be fair to Craig here, because it would be easy to make him a villain. And the truth is worse and more ordinary than that. Craig Bellamy is 39 years old, good at his job, and has spent a career telling other families how to divide what their patriarchs built. He does this professionally, competently, for strangers, using intake forms and questionnaires and financial disclosures that those strangers fill out themselves. He had never once done that with me. He had built his written summary almost entirely from things Renee told him about conversations she remembered imperfectly from a dinner 4 years earlier, filtered through his own professional assumptions about how these things usually go. And this is the part that took me 2 more days to uncover. From 6 years of increasingly detailed Sunday phone calls in which he'd been asking me questions, I answered generally, thinking I was making pleasant conversation with my son-in-law, never once understanding that he was building a file. Priya pulled the actual letter apart line by line with me that Thursday, and I'm going to give you the 2 things we found, because they're the whole spine of what happened next. First, the letter proposed dividing real property and equipment at the Route 9 facility 3 ways, immediately, as part of a current restructuring, not as an inheritance. Craig's summary had apparently conflated 2 separate conversations. One about what happens after I die, and a much more recent one about 6 months old, in which Douglas had mentioned to Renee that the shop's growth meant we needed more working capital, and that he'd raised with me the idea of Renee and Trevor getting more involved going forward. That second conversation was real. I remembered it. Douglas had asked whether Renee and Trevor might want to invest capital into the business now, in exchange for actual equity, to help fund a piece of equipment we needed. A 5-axis CNC machine, $400,000, that would let us bid on contracts we currently had to turn down. I'd told Douglas I was open to the idea in principle, but wanted to think it through properly, with Priya, before proposing anything to anyone. I had never proposed anything. I had said I was open to thinking about it. Somewhere between Douglas mentioning that conversation to Renee and Renee mentioning it to Craig, Dad is open to thinking about restructuring had become, in Craig's professional mind, the family's existing understanding of the estate structure, which he then formalized into a letter on real letterhead, scheduling a meeting to divide property I had never offered to divide. Before I get to the second thing, I want to describe an hour of my own life that Thursday, because it's the part of this story where I stopped being purely the victim of somebody else's guesswork and had to look honestly at my own part in it. Priya asked me a question I wasn't ready for. She said, "Warren, if you'd shared the actual trust with your children 4 years ago instead of just talking about it over dinner, do you think any of this happens?" I sat with that question longer than I wanted to. The honest answer is no. If Douglas, Renee, and Trevor had each had a copy of the real document, the one with real numbers, real language, a real appraiser's signature, there would have been nothing for anyone to guess about, nothing for a well-meaning son-in-law to reconstruct from secondhand memory. The whole disaster required an information vacuum, and I was the one who'd left it empty. I want to be precise about why I did that, because I don't think my reason was a good one, and I think a lot of parents make the same mistake for the same bad reason. I didn't withhold the paperwork out of secrecy or control. I withheld it because handing my children a 41-page legal document felt, to me, like admitting I was going to die, in a way that a dinner conversation over pot roast didn't. Talking about it felt like planning. Handing over the trust felt like leaving. That's not logical. Diane would have told me that in about 4 words. But grief does strange arithmetic, and for 6 years I'd been doing a lot of my thinking about the future through the lens of a wife who wasn't there to argue me out of the bad math. If you've ever put off a hard conversation with your own kids because saying it out loud felt like admitting something you weren't ready to admit, tell me in the comments how long you waited and what finally made you say it. I waited 6 years. I don't recommend it. Priya didn't let me feel sorry for myself about it for long, which is one of the things I pay her for. She said, "All right, now you know. So what are you going to do about it, starting Saturday?" The second thing we found in that letter was worse, and it is the reason I stopped feeling generous toward Craig by Friday morning. The letter listed, in an attached exhibit, an estimated valuation of Alcott Precision Tool and the Route 9 building. $4.2 million combined. And it proposed a 3-way division based on that number. I had never given anyone that number. Nobody at that firm had ever asked to see my books, my equipment list, my real estate assessment, or a single financial statement. Craig had built a valuation out of industry averages for shops, our size, pulled from some database he uses for client intake, applied to a guess about our square footage and headcount. It was wrong, not by a little. The real number, which Priya and my accountant had produced 18 months earlier for a completely unrelated loan application, was $2.6 million. And more than a third of that was tied up in equipment that would lose most of its value if sold rather than operated, which meant any division that treated it like liquid cash would have been a disaster for whoever ended up holding equipment they couldn't use and couldn't sell for what the letter claimed it was worth. My son-in-law had scheduled a meeting to divide a company using a number he invented, based on a conversation he'd heard secondhand about a proposal I'd never made, using a summary my daughter had never fact-checked with me before handing it to her husband as gospel. And my 3 children were going to sit at that table on Saturday and discuss dividing my life's work based on that letter, unless I did something before then. Before I get to Friday, I have to tell you about Thursday night, because that's when I made the phone call that told me exactly how deep this had gone. And it wasn't a call to Douglas or Renee. It was a call to my longtime shop foreman, a man named Gordon Petrakis, who has worked the floor at Alcott Precision Tool for 26 years, and who has known my kids since they were small enough to ride around the shop on a hand truck. I called Gordon because I needed a fact check from someone with no stake in any of this, and because Gordon is the kind of man who tells you the truth, even when it costs him something. I asked him a simple question. Had Douglas said anything on the floor, to anyone, about the ownership changing? Gordon was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Warren, about 2 months back, Douglas told a couple of the guys we might be restructuring ownership soon, and that things could look different by next year. I figured you knew." I hadn't known. Not that specific sentence, not in that specific form. And hearing that my own employees, men who depend on this shop for their mortgages and their kids' school clothes, had been hearing rumors about ownership changes before I had confirmed anything, that was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like a family misunderstanding and started feeling like something that could genuinely damage the business if I didn't get in front of it. I asked Gordon not to say anything further to anyone until I'd sorted it out, and he agreed, the way a man agrees when he's already decided he trusts you more than he's curious. Then I sat in my kitchen and did the math on what restructuring ownership soon would sound like to a supplier if it reached them before I'd confirmed anything. Vendors extend credit based on stability. A rumor about ownership churn, even a false one, is exactly the kind of thing that makes a purchasing manager at an aerospace supplier start quietly qualifying a second source, just in case. That's when the stakes stopped being about my feelings and started being about 22 families, whose paychecks depend on Alcott Precision Tool staying exactly as stable as it has been for 38 years. Friday morning, I sat in my truck in Priya's parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home, because I had to decide something, and it wasn't a legal decision. Priya had already told me the legal reality. Nothing in that letter had any force. I could ignore it entirely. I owned everything outright. The trust said what it said, and no letter from any attorney, however confidently worded, changes a single word of a document I never signed. The decision I actually had to make was different and harder. Did I show up Saturday, or did I let them have their meeting, discover on their own that the letter meant nothing, and wait for them to come to me? I thought about that for 20 minutes in a parking lot, and I want to give you the answer I almost chose, because I think a lot of fathers choose it, and I think it's usually the wrong one. I almost decided to stay home, to let them sort it out, to avoid the confrontation, protect my own dignity, and let the facts speak for themselves eventually, on my terms, in my own time. And then I thought about Diane, and what she would have said. And she would have said exactly this: "Warren, you spent 4 years being too proud to write it down, and now you want to spend one more Saturday being too proud to show up and say it out loud. That's the same mistake twice." So I called Douglas Friday night, and I told him I knew about the meeting, and I told him I was coming. But before that call, I made one more stop, and I want to tell you about it because it's the part of Friday that actually steadied me for Saturday. I drove out to the shop, alone, at 6 in the evening after everyone had gone home, and I walked the floor by myself for the first time in longer than I could remember doing just that, without a purpose, without checking on a job or a delivery schedule. I stood next to the original Bridgeport mill. I still keep it, off in a corner near the break room, not running anymore, more of a marker than a machine at this point. Diane used to tease me about keeping it, said I was sentimental about a piece of iron, and I always told her it wasn't sentiment. It was proof. Proof that something built by 2 people with no money and no plan could turn into 22 jobs and a building with no mortgage on it. I stood there for a while thinking about what actually scared me about Saturday, and it wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the disrespect of being planned around like I was already gone. What scared me was the possibility that if I showed up and got it wrong, too angry, too cold, too much the wounded patriarch, I'd hand my children a story about their father's temper instead of a story about their father's clarity. And that story would outlive the actual facts by decades. Families remember the tone of a fight long after they've forgotten the substance of it. So I made myself a promise, standing next to that old mill, and I kept it the whole next day. Whatever happened at that table, I was going to be the calmest person in the room, because the facts didn't need my anger to be true. They just needed to be said, in order, with the paper, to back them up. I drove home, made the copies I told you about, and called Douglas. Douglas went quiet on the phone for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "You're not supposed to know about Saturday." Not, "There's nothing to know." Not, "It's not what you think." "You're not supposed to know," which told me everything about how far this had already traveled without me, and told me something else too. My oldest son knew, at some level, that a meeting about dividing my company probably shouldn't be happening as a secret from the man who owned it. I asked him straight out how long it had been in the works, because I wanted the real timeline, not the version that made anyone look better. Douglas exhaled, the kind of breath a man takes before he decides to stop managing a conversation and just answer it. "Craig started talking to Renee about it maybe 2 months ago," he said. "She mentioned it to me about 3 weeks back, asked if I thought you'd be open to it. I told her I thought you might be, eventually, if it was handled right. I didn't know they'd already booked a lawyer until last week, and by then, it felt like it was too far along to stop without a whole fight, so I just went along with attending. 2 months of a plan taking shape. 3 weeks of Douglas knowing enough to raise a real concern. 1 week of a scheduled legal meeting he'd chosen to attend rather than interrupt. I did the arithmetic on that out loud, not unkindly, because I wanted him to hear it the way I was hearing it. "So for a week, you knew there was a lawyer-drafted letter dividing my company sitting on Renee's dining room table, and your plan was to show up Saturday and see how it went." He didn't defend that. He just said quietly, "Yeah, that's about right." I asked him one more plain question. "Douglas, did you tell Renee and Craig that I'd agreed to restructure the ownership?" And my son, to his credit, did not lie to me. He said, "I told Renee you were open to talking about it. I don't know what Craig did with that after." I believed him, and I still believe him. Douglas's sin in this story is a real one, and I will get to it. But it is not the sin everyone assumed going in. And to understand why, you need to understand how Douglas actually operates, which is different from how Renee and Trevor operate, and different again from how I operate. Douglas learned the trade the same way I did, on the floor, hands on the machines, and men who learn that way tend to develop a specific kind of respect for chain of command, even inside a family. He would never, in 1,000 years, have gone around me the way Craig did, drafting letters and valuations. What Douglas does instead, when something makes him uncomfortable, is go quiet and hope the discomfort resolves itself before he has to be the one to name it. I've watched him do it on the shop floor for a decade, with vendors, with difficult customers, even with employees who needed to be corrected and weren't. He is an excellent operator and a reluctant conflict manager. And those two traits combined meant that when Renee started talking about the plan as though it were settled, Douglas's instinct was to nod along rather than correct the record, and hope the actual, real conversation with me would happen before anything formal got drafted. It did not happen before anything formal got drafted. That's the gap Craig walked through. I mention all of this not to excuse Douglas, but because it matters for what happened at that table, and it matters for how I've dealt with him since. A man who lies to protect himself needs a different kind of correction than a man who stays silent to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. I was going to need to tell the difference clearly once I was standing in that dining room, because treating the second kind of failure like the first kind would have cost me a relationship with my oldest son that I was not willing to lose over another man's spreadsheet. He hadn't tried to cut anyone out. If anything, Douglas's actual position, once I finally heard it stated plainly, was that he was uncomfortable with how much Craig had built out of one conversation, and he'd been too conflict-averse to correct it once Renee started treating the plan as settled. I told Douglas I'd be there Saturday at 11, and I asked him one favor. Don't warn Renee and Craig that I was coming. Not to ambush anyone. I want to be clear about my reasoning, because it matters. But because I had watched, for 4 days, how quickly a guess turns into a plan once enough people repeat it to each other without checking, I did not want 48 hours for a new, adjusted version of the story to form before I got there. I wanted the actual documents to meet the actual room at the same time. Saturday morning, before I left the house, I did the thing that made the rest of the day possible. And it's the thing I'd tell any parent in a situation like mine to do first, before anything else. I went to my fireproof filing cabinet, and I made copies. Not selectively. Not the parts that made me look good. Everything relevant. The full trust document, all 41 pages. The deed to the Route 9 building. The 18-month-old valuation Priya and my accountant had prepared for the loan application, with the real $2.6 million number on it, signed and dated by a licensed appraiser. And a single handwritten page, my own handwriting, that I'd made the night after that dinner 4 years ago, dated, summarizing exactly what I'd told my 3 children that night. Because even 4 years ago, some instinct in me had wanted at least one written record to exist, even if I never showed it to anyone. I made 4 copies of everything, one for each of my children and one for myself. I drove to Douglas's house with a banker's box on the passenger seat of my truck, and I sat in his driveway for a minute before going in, the way I'd sat in Priya's parking lot the day before, except this time I wasn't deciding whether to go in. I was just breathing. Renee's car was there. Craig's car was there. Trevor had flown in Friday night, which meant this had been planned for at least a week, possibly longer, without one phone call to me. I knocked. Douglas answered, and behind him I could see the dining room table, and on it, printed and stapled, 4 copies of the letter I'd already read, plus a stapled packet I hadn't seen. Craig's exhibit. Pie charts, a proposed timeline, draft language for restructuring the LLC. Renee saw me first, and her face did something complicated. Happiness, then confusion, then something closer to dread, all in about 2 seconds. And I understood in that instant that some part of my daughter had known this meeting wouldn't survive contact with me, and had scheduled it anyway, hoping to get further along before that contact happened. Craig stood up. He's a tall man, comfortable in rooms like this, and he said, warm as anything, "Warren, we didn't want to bother you with logistics until we had something concrete to bring you." Something concrete. My own company's ownership structure, made concrete by a man who had never asked to see a single deed. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood, because I know how these stories usually go in the telling, and mine doesn't go that way. I set the banker's box down on the one open corner of the table next to Craig's pie charts, and I said, "I got the letter. I thought I should be part of the meeting about my own company." There was a silence after I set that box down, and I want to describe it honestly, because it lasted longer than any silence I can remember in that family, and it wasn't a comfortable one. Renee had gone pale. Craig had gone very still. The specific stillness of a man recalculating in real time. Douglas wouldn't look at anyone. Trevor kept glancing between the pie charts and my face, like he was trying to figure out which document was the real one. Craig broke it first, but not with an apology. He said, reasonable as anything, gesturing at his own stapled packet. "Warren, I understand this feels sudden, but if we table the conversation now, we lose momentum on some time-sensitive tax planning. There are advantages to restructuring before the end of the fiscal year that..." I let him finish. That was deliberate. Priya had told me the night before that the single most useful thing I could do in that room was let every wrong assumption say itself out loud completely, because a half-interrupted mistake can be argued with, but a fully spoken one has nowhere left to hide. When he finished, I said, "Craig, there's no restructuring to time. There's a trust that already says what happens, and it doesn't need year-end tax planning, because nothing in it is changing based on a letter you wrote using numbers nobody gave you." Trevor, God bless him, was the first to say the honest thing out loud. He looked at the pie charts, then at me, then said, "Wait, Dad didn't ask for this meeting." And there it was, laid bare in 6 words from the one sibling who'd had the least stake in pretending otherwise. Nobody at that table, before I walked in, had actually confirmed with the one person who owned everything that any of this was real. Before Craig said anything, Renee did something I want to describe carefully, because it's the detail that told me my daughter's instincts were better than the situation she'd let herself get talked into. She stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me first, before a single word about the letter got said, and she held on a beat longer than a normal hello hug, and she said quietly, just to me, "I'm glad you came." I believe she meant it, and I believe some part of her had been hoping, for days, that I'd show up and make the whole thing stop before it went further than it already had. That's not an excuse for how it got started, but it told me, right at the start of the hardest conversation of that whole ordeal, that I wasn't walking into a room full of people trying to take something from me. I was walking into a room full of people who'd gotten lost, following a confident man's confident guess, and at least one of them already knew it. Craig recovered fast. That's the thing about people who talk for a living. They don't stay knocked off balance long. He said, "Warren, we're not trying to go around you. This is exactly the conversation we wanted to have with you at the table." I said, "Then let's have it. Sit down. I want to walk you through what I did next slowly, because it's the only part of this story I planned in advance, and it worked exactly the way I hoped it would, which almost never happens. I didn't argue with the pie charts. I didn't attack Craig's numbers point by point in the moment, the way I badly wanted to. Instead, I opened the banker's box, and I handed each of my 3 children a copy of the same 3 documents: the trust, the 18-month-old valuation with the real number on it, and my handwritten page from 4 years ago. I said, "I'm not here to fight about what I said at dinner 4 years ago. I wrote down what I said that same night, because I had a feeling someday I'd need to prove I said it. Read it. Then read the trust. Then we'll talk about what, if anything, needs to change." Renee read the handwritten page first, and I watched her face while she did it, because that page was the one that mattered most to her specifically. It said, in my own handwriting, dated 4 years earlier, "Majority operating interest to Douglas. Fixed cash distribution to Renee and Trevor from life insurance proceeds, not company equity. Route 9, building to remain in trust, income shared 3 ways." Nowhere in my 4-year-old handwriting, and nowhere in the trust itself, was there a $4.2 million valuation, an immediate restructuring, or Renee and Trevor receiving equity in the operating company at all. The plan had always been cash for them, ownership for Douglas, income from the building for everyone. Craig's letter had proposed something that didn't just misstate the numbers. It proposed an entirely different structure than the one that had ever existed. One where all 3 kids became co-owners of a company only one of them had ever worked in. Craig, reading over Renee's shoulder, said, "This valuation is from 18 months ago. Businesses appreciate." And I said the thing that ended his position at that table, calmly, because Priya had prepared me for exactly this. Craig, this valuation is signed by a licensed commercial appraiser who walked the building and reviewed the equipment list. Yours is based on an industry average for shops our size that you pulled without ever asking to see our equipment list or our books. If you'd like, I can have my accountant call your firm's compliance department and ask whether it's standard practice to draft estate restructuring letters based on unverified second-hand estimates. I don't think that's a conversation you want. I want to be honest about something here, because I promised myself I would tell this whole story straight. That sentence had teeth in it, and I meant it to. I am not a vindictive man, and I didn't file anything, and I never called anyone's compliance department. But I needed Craig to understand, in that room, in front of my children, that professional confidence isn't the same thing as professional diligence, and that he'd skipped the second one entirely. He didn't have an answer. He looked at Renee instead of at me, which told its own story. And Renee, this is the part I'm proudest of, and it's not about me. Renee put the papers down and said, to her husband, in front of her father and both her brothers, "Craig, did you ever actually ask Dad any of this? Or did you build the whole plan out of what I remembered from one dinner?" He didn't answer that either, not right away. And in the silence, Douglas said the thing he should have said weeks earlier. He said, "I told Renee Dad was thinking about it. I never said he'd agreed to anything. I should have called and said something the second I heard there was a letter and a valuation. I didn't want to be the one who blew up Renee's plan, so I just let it happen." That's Douglas's actual sin, and I want it named clearly because it's the one every family recognizes, even when nobody says it out loud. Not malice, not greed, but the specific cowardice of watching a small misunderstanding grow into a large one, and staying quiet, because correcting it felt harder than living with it. Trevor, who had said almost nothing until then, finally spoke, and he said the plainest thing anyone said all day. He looked at the pie chart, then at his sister, then at me, and said, "Can we just ask Dad what he actually wants, instead of guessing?" So I told them, again, out loud, at that table, with all 4 documents sitting in front of everyone. And this time, I didn't stop at telling them. I told them we were going to fix the actual problem, the real one underneath Craig's letter, which was that I'd never given them anything in writing in the first place. We sat at that table for another hour after Douglas admitted his part in it, and I want to give you the 2 exchanges from that hour that mattered most, because the confrontation was over by then, and what came next was harder and more useful. The first was with Renee, alone in Douglas's kitchen, while the others stayed at the table. She followed me in there to get water she didn't need, which is a thing my daughter has done since she was 9 years old, whenever she wanted to talk to me without an audience. She said, "Dad, I need you to know I didn't mean for it to turn into a legal letter. I told Craig what I remembered, and I thought he was just going to help me understand it. I didn't think he was going to build a whole plan out of it." I believed her, and I told her so. But I also told her the thing I needed her to hear, because loving Craig doesn't excuse what happened, and pretending it does would have taught her nothing. I said, "Renee, you're a grown woman with a finance background of your own. You didn't need Craig to interpret a conversation about my company. You could have called me and asked. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a while, turning the water glass in her hand. And then she gave me an answer more honest than I expected, because it was easier to let Craig handle it than to call you and maybe find out you'd already decided something I wasn't going to like. If he brought me a plan, I could react to the plan instead of asking you a question I was scared of the answer to. That's the sentence I keep coming back to, months later, more than anything Craig did. My daughter was more afraid of a direct conversation with her own father than she was of a stranger's legal letter dividing his company. That's not Craig's failure. That one is mine. Built up over 6 years of a certain kind of distance, I hadn't noticed I was keeping. One Sunday phone call at a time, always pleasant, never quite honest about anything that mattered. The second exchange was with Douglas, out on the driveway, after everyone else had gone back inside. He said, "I should have called you the day I heard about the letter, not the day you showed up with a box." I told him he was right, and I told him something else, because I think it's the fairest thing I've ever said to my oldest son. "Douglas, you've spent 6 years doing the actual work of keeping this company running, while I grieved your mother in my own slow way. I'm not going to pretend that debt runs only one direction. I let you carry more than your share on the floor, and I never wrote anything down to make sure you'd be protected for it. We both let silence do a job that should have belonged to paper." He looked at the ground for a second, and then he asked me the question that told me he'd actually heard it. "So what happens now? With the machine, with the equity thing I brought up? Does all that go away because of how this happened?" I told him no, and I meant it. The idea was a good one, Douglas. Bringing capital in from your siblings for real equity in exchange for growth they'd share in, that's not a bad plan. It just needed to start with a real proposal from me, with real numbers, instead of a guess dressed up as a settled fact. We'll do it right, starting Monday, with Priya in the room from the first conversation this time. Nobody drafts a single page until every one of you has heard the same numbers from the same source at the same time. That's the promise I kept 3 weeks later, in Priya's office, with all 3 of my children present, and nobody's spouse drafting anything on the side. He didn't say much back. He just nodded, and we stood in that driveway for a while not talking, which in my family is sometimes the most honest conversation available. Here's what actually happened after that Saturday, because a story like this owes you the follow-through, not just the confrontation. I called Priya Monday morning and asked her to do the thing I should have done 4 years earlier. Prepare a full, plain language summary of the trust, no legal jargon where it could be avoided, and schedule a meeting with all 3 of my children present, with me in her office, where every question could be answered by the person whose job it is to answer them correctly. We held that meeting 3 weeks later. Craig was not invited, and I want to explain why, because it wasn't punishment. Priya explained it better than I could have. This needed to be a meeting about my children's inheritance from their father, not a meeting about their spouse's opinions of it. Renee agreed without an argument, which told me she'd already done some thinking of her own in those 3 weeks. Priya walked through the trust page by page. She confirmed the real valuation, with the appraiser on a conference call to answer any technical questions. She explained exactly what fixed cash distribution funded by life insurance meant in practice, with real numbers, so nobody was working from memory of a dinner conversation ever again. And at my request, she drew up a short, plain document. Not a change to the trust itself, just a letter, signed by me and witnessed by all 3 of my children, restating what I'd told them 4 years ago, so that this time, everyone in the family had the same piece of paper. Douglas got the majority operating interest, as always intended, but we also formalized something new, a path for him to buy out a small percentage of additional equity over the next 10 years, funded by the business's own growth rather than anything coming out of his siblings' share. That part came from Douglas himself at that second meeting, and I think it was his way of trying to make something right without saying the words out loud. Renee and Trevor's cash distributions stayed exactly what they'd always been, tied to the life insurance policy, not to company equity, not to the building's appreciating value, exactly as I'd written it in my own hand 4 years earlier. There's one more thing that came out of that second meeting at Priya's office that I haven't told you, and it's the one Priya says she'll remember longest out of 11 years of family estate work. About halfway through her plain language walkthrough of the trust, Renee stopped her and asked a question that had nothing to do with numbers. She asked, "Dad, Is there anything in here about what happens if one of us needs help before you're gone? Like, actually needs it, not just wants a bigger piece. I hadn't thought to put anything like that in writing, because in 38 years of running that shop, helping each other before something bad happens had always just been a thing our family did, never a clause anyone needed spelled out. But Renee's question told me something true about what this whole ordeal had actually been about underneath the paperwork. My children weren't only worried about what they'd inherit, they were worried about whether they could still come to me, honestly, before a crisis, without it turning into a formal negotiation. So we added one more page to the plain language letter Priya drafted. Not a change to the trust itself, just a statement, signed by me, that any of my 3 children could come to me directly at any time about a real need, without going through a lawyer, a spreadsheet, or a sibling first, and that I would rather hear an uncomfortable request stated plainly than discover a comfortable guess about it 2 years later in a certified letter. Trevor read that page out loud at the table, and for the first time all day, all 3 of my children laughed, the real kind, at the specific absurdity of a grown man having to promise his adult children that they were allowed to just ask him things. And the 5-axis CNC machine, the $400,000 piece of equipment that started this whole chain of misunderstanding months ago. We bought it. Douglas and I financed it through the business itself, the ordinary way, with a small loan against equipment we already owned outright. The way businesses have financed equipment since long before anyone needed a family meeting to do it. It's running 6 days a week now, and it paid for 1/3 of itself in the first year. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I get to Craig, because it's the one that actually closed this out for me, and it happened almost by accident. About 2 months after the meeting at Priya's office, Gordon Petrakis, my foreman, stopped me on the floor on a Friday afternoon and asked if I had a minute. We stood by the 5-axis machine, still new enough then that the smell of cutting fluid on it was different from the older equipment, and Gordon said, "The guys have been asking. Word got around that there was some kind of family thing about ownership. You want me to tell them anything? Or is that not my business?" I thought about it for a second, and then I told Gordon the truth, the plain version, because I'd learned something expensive that summer about what happens when the truth doesn't get told first. I said, "Tell them the ownership hasn't changed and isn't changing. Douglas is being set up to take over the business the way we always planned, on a normal schedule, over years, funded by the business itself. Nothing about their jobs, their contracts, or this company's stability changed for one single day this whole time. There was a family misunderstanding about paperwork, and it's been fixed." Gordon nodded, and then he said something that stuck with me longer than almost anything anyone said inside my own family that summer. He said, "Good. Some of the guys were quietly looking at what else was out there. Rumors like that cost you good people if you let them sit too long. And good machinists aren't easy to replace on short notice, Warren. You know that better than anybody. I lost exactly 0 employees over the whole affair, as far as I know. But Gordon's sentence told me how close I'd come, and it told me something else too. The real cost of 4 years of silence hadn't stopped at my dining room table. It had traveled all the way down to the shop floor, into the private worries of 22 men and women who had nothing to do with my estate planning, and everything to do with feeding their own families. That's the conversation that finally made the whole thing feel finished to me, more than any lawyer's letter or family meeting. Not because Gordon forgave me for anything. He never framed it that way, and neither did I. But because it was the moment I understood the actual size of what a little honesty, offered 4 years earlier, would have protected. Not just 3 of my children's feelings, an entire shop's worth of ordinary lives that had nothing to do with the family drama sitting quietly on top of them the whole time. Trevor called me a week after the meeting at Priya's office, which surprised me, because Trevor calls on birthdays and not much else. And this wasn't anyone's birthday. He said he'd been thinking about that Saturday the whole flight home, and he wanted to say one thing he hadn't said at the table. "Dad, I don't have a stake in this company, and I never wanted one. And I think that's actually why I saw it clearest. Nobody was lying to hurt you. Everybody was just afraid to ask you a direct question and get a direct answer. Renee was afraid of what you'd say. Douglas was afraid of picking a side. I was afraid of being the one who caused a fight by asking why there even was a letter. I asked him what he thought that meant we should do differently, going forward, and my youngest son, who had never once asked for a stake in anything I owned, gave me an answer simpler than anything the lawyers had offered. He said, "Just tell us things before we have to guess them, even the small stuff, especially the small stuff, honestly, because that's the stuff that turns into big misunderstandings when nobody says it plainly." I've tried to live by that since. It's a smaller lesson than a 41-page trust document, and it might be the more important one. I wrote it on an index card and put it in my truck's glove box, right next to the registration, where I'd actually see it once in a while, instead of filing it away with the paperwork I'd already proven I could avoid for years at a stretch. Craig and I have spoken exactly twice since that Saturday. The first time was an apology, stiff and clearly rehearsed at Thanksgiving. And I accepted it the way you accept an apology from someone you're going to keep seeing at every holiday for the rest of your life, fully, and without pretending it erases anything. The second time, this spring, he asked me a direct question before doing anything, whether I'd mind if he helped Renee think through her own retirement planning, using her actual accounts, with actual numbers I'd be willing to share if I chose to. I told him I'd think about it. And I told him the one thing I needed him to carry forward from all of this, plainly, without any softening. The next time he had a thought about my company, my estate, or my money, it went to me first, directly, before it went anywhere near a letterhead. He said he understood, and he said it looking me directly in the eye instead of at his phone, which for Craig is its own small kind of progress. I believe he does. That's further than I'd have gotten a year ago, and it is honest, slow, unglamorous progress between two men, which is the only kind I have ever really trusted. If a story like this one is worth your time, subscribing is the easiest way to be here for the next one, because there's always another family finding out the hard way that silence about money doesn't keep the peace. It just delays the argument and lets someone else write the terms. Last thing. That handwritten page from 4 years ago is framed now in my office at the shop, next to the appraiser's report and a photograph of that first Bridgeport mill I bought used, 38 years back. I didn't frame it for pride. I framed it so that the next time somebody in this family has a guess about what I want, there's a piece of paper on the wall that answers before the guessing can start. The 5-axis machine sits about 20 feet from that wall. Douglas runs it himself most Fridays, and he told me last month, half joking, that he checks the framed page every time he walks past it, just to make sure he still remembers what it says. I told him that's exactly why I hung it low enough to read without stopping, at exactly eye level for a man his height, standing exactly where he stands most Fridays, checking a machine his own money helped bring into this shop, in a building that has never once, in 38 years, needed a lawyer's letter to tell any of us who it belonged to.